All right, so in this third and final video from chapter 7, I'm gonna share a little bit about the work of Lev Vygotsky. So quick bio sketch on Vygotsky. He was born to middle-class Jewish parents. He studied history and philosophy, and then also studied law. And so he was actually enrolled in two different universities at the same time. And a lot of his theory, well, he's Russian, so this may not be terribly surprising. A lot of his theory reflects a Marxist mindset. And he actually, unfortunately, died of tuberculosis at the age of 37. So all the work that he did was done before that time. So just a remarkable influence, especially given how early he passed. He's really truly a genius in the field of psychology, and could have potentially made such a larger impact if only he had lived a little bit longer. So the main ideas in Vygotsky's theory, three main ideas. First off, culture shapes our thoughts. So the world around us and the culture that we are raised in shapes the way we perceive the world. The second one is that language shapes our thoughts. And of course, language and culture are related, but the language that we have helps shape the way we think about the world around us. And then finally, the way we interact with others influences what we are capable of doing. So first off, culture. So Vygotsky argued like culture and social interaction help us develop our human consciousness. So Piaget really emphasized um, the aspects within the child, right? The ideas of conservation, the cognitive capacities within the child. Um, Vygotsky really emphasized the forces that are outside of the child. So how culture and the values of the broader society, the family, how that impacts the child. So what he argued is social interaction is fundamentally involved in the development of cognition. So cultures are these powerful, dynamic, changing things that exert a tremendous influence on each of us. They shape how we think and act. So you could just think of all the huge societal shifts that we've seen in our generation in the last 20 to 30 years, views on, political views in regards to Medicare for all, in regards to maybe talk about homosexuality. There's been incredible shifts, and really the cognitions, the thoughts about some key questions have really changed. And a lot of those shifts have been cultural changes. So just really emphasizing that the way we think about problems, it's embedded in the culture around us. And he distinguished between elementary mental functions and higher mental functions. So elementary mental functions are basically essentially unlearned tendencies, just the capacity to see the world around us, to process information, the sensations and motor movements. I mean, there's certain things that culture doesn't really touch. But there are other things that are uh, higher level and problem solving, imagining, um, you know, uh, interpreting. These are where culture can come to play. So the primary form that our culture shapes us is through language. So we develop language to describe our situations. And so you've probably heard of the idea like Eskimos have, I forget how many, but they have a lot of words for snow. And this idea that the language, the words and the phrases and the vocabulary that we have accessible to us shapes the way we think about things. So if we have words for something, we can distinguish it. I'm just thinking about how in French, there's a word for uh, to know as a fact, comprendre. I'm butchering the pronunciation, but It's to think and to about facts, to know facts, and they have a different word, savoir, to talk about to know personally, intimately. So you may know facts about the history of the United States, but do you know intimately? You don't know intimately those facts, but you know your wife or your children. You know people. You can know other things more intimately, and so they have a different word for that. In English, we just have one word, and so we think about knowing. We don't necessarily make a distinction about, do I know it intimately or do I know it just on a superficial level? So the language we have can shape us and cause us to think differently about things. So the child develops language, and as a result, develops logical thinking. And the only way that we are able to think logically is by using language. So just think about all the ways that you reason through things. It's really through language. You weigh the pros and cons. Well, that requires putting words to things. So cognitive development is largely what Vygotsky said. It's not just a language within us; it's a language that is between people. It's an interaction between the child and adults. And one of the research studies that Vygotsky used was the block study. And basically, they were asked to organize blocks according to nonsense words. So it was sort of a problem-solving and categorizing task. And Vygotsky made an interesting conclusion. He argued that thought and language are initially independent, but with development, they become intertwined. Um, and yet he says that language and thought, although they're intertwined, they're still not quite the same. That we can think without language, and we can have we can have a language without a fullness of thought, right? And so I think this next slide explains what this means. So he argued that there's these stages of language, and the way that people use language to solve problems. So at first, there's just social speech. So we have these, we use, when we're from birth to about 3 years old, we use language to control behaviors of others. We issue commands, milk, give me milk. And we communicate simple concepts. But around the age of 3 years old or 4 years old, we start to shift to egocentric, what Vygotsky called egocentric speech. And you've probably seen children do this, where they will be engaged in some task and they'll be talking to themselves. They'll be guiding their own behavior. Oh, they'll maybe playing with toys and say, "Oh, he's gonna get you," and and like in play, there's often that egocentric speech. They're guiding their own behaviors, or if they're working on homework assignments, they might speak out loud. Oh, I've got to do this next, and so they're trying to. They have language, and they're trying to use language to sort of guide their thought process. And then after about 7 years old, we start to develop self-talk that is internal to us, that we don't actually say out loud, and it allows us to observe and direct our own thinking. And I think that's an interesting sort of perspective that Vygotsky offers. So Vygotsky, a lot of his theory has been applied to education. So he argues that children's learning is about occurs through a special relationship between teachers and the students. The teacher learns from and about the child, even as the child learns because of the teacher's actions. So it's this sort of dynamic interaction between the teacher and the student that allows for learning to occur. And again, it's a two-way learning, not just a one-way. And the key concept that Vygotsky uses is the zone of proximal development. So what Vygotsky felt is that the child, right? How does the child go about learning? Well, if you try to teach a 7-year-old calculus, you're not going to get anywhere. The child doesn't have any readiness to learn calculus. And if you try to teach a 12-year-old simple addition, that child's going to be tremendously bored because they'll have mastered that. So Vygotsky pointed out that there's a zone where the student is incapable of doing something by themselves, but with the help of a competent tutor, teacher, sort of a mentor, they're capable of doing something. So they can do something with the encouragement and guidance and structure of a person, again, but they cannot do it alone without them. So in this zone of proximal development, that's what Vygotsky said, that's where the real learning occurs. That you want to engage students in this zone to make it difficult, but not so difficult that they just have no capability of learning it. And related to this concept is the idea of scaffolding. So in that zone of proximal development, the student will learn if you provide scaffolding. Now, scaffolding is a metaphor, right? So you probably know that if they're in a construction project, scaffolding is like the structures outside of the building where they have different layers, and it's that you envelop a whole building with these scaffolds so that you could build on it. That the educator is providing the scaffolding and building and helping something develop. Again, it's in this zone of proximal development. They're supporting the students' development and guiding them and helping them learn. So they provide scaffolding by telling, demonstrating, showing, correcting, pointing, urging, providing models. So when a student is not capable of doing something, but is capable of doing it with support, the teacher's role is to engage that student, provide them with support, again, with any of these questions, identifying objects, helping draw their attention to certain things, reminding of things that they already know. When you do that, the student often is able to learn that material to step into it. And it's really about this idea of, instead of Piaget, where he talked about these, big steps from one stage to another, Vygotsky allowed for, okay, there's a lot of gradual changes that occur throughout a child's life, and really throughout an adult's life, and that those gradual changes are the result of the scaffolding we have around us. So taking this idea, you can actually apply it clinically. So some clients are deficient. One way they might be deficient is in social skills. They may not know how to build good relationships with the people in their life around them. And that can be the result of, as a child, they may have had friendships, but those friendships were not the result of, they just sort of happen because people get stuck in the same situation together. And if they have people around them that, start a relationship with them, they can develop friendships. But as adults, sometimes if you don't have the skills to connect with another person, to share intimate details, to be vulnerable, to be assertive, whatever that is, you can be sort of left out. And so the therapist can actually provide scaffolding with the client. They can provide scaffolding in finding a job, right? Uh, the client may know, oh, I guess I need to apply for jobs, but sometimes a client can feel overwhelmed by the idea of applying for jobs. So a therapist can actually come in and say, okay, well, here's how you go about this process. You have to develop a resume, and you have to look for jobs. So the therapist can scaffold and help the person. All right, they may have knowledge to do those things, but again, it's that zone of proximal development that they just can't quite do it, put it all together on their own. So they, maybe it's asking someone out. Maybe they struggle in dating relationships. Again, they probably on their own can they know what to say in their head, but to say it in a moment where they're in front of a person that they have feelings for and dealing with potential for rejection, a therapist can help scaffold so that the client can be capable of doing something that risky, that vulnerable. And then it could be things like good hygiene and grooming. And so again, all these things are typically within the zone of proximal development for the clients that we work with. They're capable of doing it, but they don't often do these things. And so if you're helping them, you can, if you're helping them effectively, you can ask them questions, help them reflect, help them put things together, not doing it for them, but creating a space where they learn how to do it for themselves. So I think Vygotsky's just got some brilliant ideas, and yet you can also say that it's not a highly scientific theory. Nevertheless, it does a good job to simplify complex observations. It has very important practical implications, and it really has stimulated and guided a lot of research in the social sciences. And so there's a lot of benefit to it. All right, so kind of quickly, I just want to do a quick review, and this is going back to the last two videos. So first off, Brunner, the main takeaways is that he talked a lot about categorizing, that we categorize based on sensoromotor interactions. We categorize based on visual perception, and then we categorize based on symbolic. So we have the inactive, iconic, and symbolic representations that we categorize. And then in his later theories, he talked about narratives that impute meaning on events and how important it is to create stories about ourselves and about our lives. Again, that it's not just about categorizing, but also about storytelling. Piaget talked about adaptation, and it's a balance of assimilation and accommodation. Piaget said that we represent and respond to the world using schemas. Schemas are cognitive structures and cognitive organizations. Piaget said that our schemas develop in stages. We have sensoromotor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operations. And then we have Vygotsky, again, arguing culture shapes our understanding of the world and our thoughts, that language is intertwined with but distinct from our thoughts. And then finally, that there's this zone of proximal development where people are sometimes capable of doing things with help that they cannot do on their own. So what are some spiritual applications? This is our final slide. Brunner would say spirituality provides a narrative from which we can create meaning. Again, these key overarching stories, like that God is in a covenantal relationship with us, that salvation and redemption is offered to us through grace. Piaget would say spirituality is about forming schemas, forming understandings of the world, schemas in regards to our perceptions and schemas in regards to what we do. And we are always assimilating and accommodating to new experiences. Now that sounds kind of dry, but let me give you a thought on that. When Job, you know the story of Job from the Bible, Job underwent some humongous tragedies in his life. And one of the things, if you look at the book of Job, is clear is that when he was first wrestling with why is this happening to me, he actually thought, well, God is a God who blesses those who are good and punishes those who are evil. And so this idea that the world is organized so that the good get good stuff and the bad get bad stuff. And one of the important lessons that Job had to make is that's not actually how God works, that the rain falls on the just and unjust alike, that good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people. And that was part of Job's accommodation. He had to understand that his view of God was actually wrong. And really often suffering seems to exist to help us correct some of the misconceptions we have about who God is and how the world works. So I just think that's kind of an example that there is some real depth to some of these ideas when you apply them. And then finally, Vygotsky would say spirituality is rooted not just in an internal experience with God, not just vertically, if you've ever heard that term, but also horizontally. It's rooted in, we're in communities that provide us with a language to talk about our faith, and that provide us with culture that shapes the way we perceive the world and the way we respond to our world. And that finally, we scaffolding. That's an interesting idea to think about. How do we grow and mature in our faith? Well, in some ways, we have like a capacity. We have our capacity to live out our faith in some ways, but how do we get to that next level? Well, if you applied Vygotsky's idea that we need scaffolding to get to a deeper level of maturity in our faith and in our understanding of the way Christianity should be lived out. So again, I think there's some real cool applications of these ideas. Hopefully you enjoyed this chapter material. Again, I love this material. If you really wrestle with it, it's very thought-provoking. And yeah, I'm going to wrap up there. Okay, take care.